For 200 years, the work of Black journalists has been crucial to the lives of Black people in America. But the model for independent reporting is in decline, and disinformation prevails, targeted at Black communities. So we did something about it. We created a nonprofit network of local newsrooms anchored by a national hub, a different kind of news model for Black audiences, too often left behind, with stories too often untold. With our sustainable business model designed for the current market, we listen to and partner with the communities we serve to produce journalism that will expose injustice, inform policy, hold leaders to account, and equip Black audiences with the truth. Truth we deserve, news we need.
Hello, and welcome to the first ever Capital B Fest. I'm Lauren Williams, co-founder and CEO of Capital B. Thank you so much for joining this event, where we will gather the Black elected officials, business innovators, and thought leaders who are leading us into the future. Over the next 2 days, we'll hear from people in politics, tech, entrepreneurship, and more. We'll talk about all the ways Black people are working to solve problems, create opportunities, and move our country and ourselves forward. Today, we'll focus on politics and the economy, talking to Black leaders, including Wisconsin Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes and Birmingham Mayor Randall Woodfin, about how the political process can create change in our communities. And we'll hear about the state of the racial wealth gap and real policy solutions to narrow it. Capital B was built on the belief that Black people, our stories, and our communities are critical to the fabric of this nation. The next 2 days will focus on having the conversations that highlight this point and build upon the day-to-day work of our amazing journalists. If you aren't already a member, please consider becoming one by heading to capitalbnews.org and clicking the membership button. I'd also like to give a special thanks to our Atlanta audience. We're so thrilled to have launched our first local newsroom in this dynamic city. In honor of Capital B Atlanta, I'm happy to share this message from Atlanta Mayor Andre Dickens, followed by our day one programming. Thank you so much for joining us. Enjoy.
Hello, I'm Mayor Andre Dickens. Congratulations to the folks at Capital B on your inaugural Capital B Fest, your 2-day virtual summit on politics, technology, business, and more. The panels sound like they're gonna be amazing. Using technology to address equity in healthcare, growing the pipeline to address a lack of diversity in certain tech fields, closing the racial wealth gap, and of course, I'll miss the panel on Black mayors leading Black communities. I'm sorry I can't join the event as it's happening this year, but I look forward to next year.
Good afternoon, and welcome to Capital B's Black Mayors Panel. My name is Chauncey Alcorn. I'm political reporter for Capital B Atlanta. Today, we'll be talking about the current political landscape in cities across the country and the challenges that some Black mayors may face that other mayors do not. I'm joined today first by Mr. Randall Woodfin, Mayor of Birmingham, Alabama, as well as Khalid Kamau, Mayor of South Fulton, Georgia, which is a majority Black city located in the Atlanta metro area. Thanks so much to both of you, Mr. Woodfin and Mr. Kamau, for joining us here today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
So first, let's jump right into it, guys. We've seen, obviously, in the last couple of years, a wave of Black mayors winning elections and re-elections in cities across America over the last 2 years, particularly in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder in 2020. Many of these mayors were elected or re-elected on platforms of improving racial equity, racial disparities in areas such as home ownership, and particularly police reform in the aftermath of that terrible, tragic incident with Mr. Floyd, as well as other cases with Breonna Taylor across the country. That wave of of new and current mayors has coincided, unfortunately, with the pandemic-related surge in crime that is coming to a head as we enter the summer this year. We've seen a surge in mass shootings across the country, including this weekend. There were at least 3 fatally shot in Philadelphia over the weekend. And I believe as well, certainly shootings in Birmingham. First and foremost, this is a question for both of you. What are your thoughts on the ongoing epidemic of gun violence across the country?
Well, I would say gun violence was a pandemic and crisis prior to the coronavirus. Gun violence was a crisis during the coronavirus, and as the global health pandemic takes on a new form and has decreased, gun violence is still a crisis in not just the Black community, but it's America's problem. Back in 2019, prior to COVID, I declared actually in the city limits of Birmingham, gun violence as a public health crisis. I thought it was important to not only declare that, but look at gun violence through a public health lens, because you can't arrest your way out of gun violence in communities. And so if you look at solving gun violence from a toolbox standpoint, on one hand, and there are 3 tools in this toolbox. There's enforcement, but there's also prevention and another tool of reentry measures. And I think for us, we've attempted to tackle gun violence as a public health crisis through additional resources outside of law enforcement, which also includes engaging the next generation of young folk of emotional learning and behavior, as well as conflict resolution from a curriculum-based standpoint to teach young people as they get older. There are other forms of how to respond when somebody makes you mad or makes you angry versus picking up a gun or another weapon and using it to hurt the person that you already know.
I second everything that Mayor Woodfin said. The city of South Fulton, we are a new city. We're Atlanta's twin city, and with a 92% African American population, we are the Blackest big city in America. We have actually, while other cities have seen this increase in violence during the pandemic, we've actually had 3 years of double-digit decreases in crime. I attribute that to 2 things. One, we have an incredible police chief and a police force that looks like the people that they are policing, right? And we have a take-home car program. So we are really doing community policing in the sense that it is people from our community that are policing our community. And I think that makes a big difference in how we can de-escalate things and just our overall approach to thinking about not only responding to crimes, but really trying to prevent crimes. And the second thing that I would really attribute our success to is, as a councilman before I became mayor, in the first year of our cityhood, we looked at making parks funding the #1 priority in our budget, increasing our parks funding. So we have really been trying to invest. Many of our crimes are being committed by young people, and we have really made a commitment here in South Fulton to invest in our young people before they get into trouble. So just having a restorative justice approach and making those investments in the people that are most at risk to be both perpetrators and victims of crime, I think is how we've had these 3-year double-digit decreases.
Thank you. And yeah, I was going to ask you about that, Mayor Kamau. You touched on this quite already. The success that you guys have had in South Fulton is remarkable, and it's notable in the fact both of the demographic makeup, and you guys are, right below Atlanta, where we've seen, huge surges in violent crime. Could you talk a little bit more about some of the things that you guys are doing to address crime in South Fulton and why some of the successes that you've had versus other areas of both the region and the country?
Well, again, I think we're doing a data-driven analysis, towards crime. We're right now partnering with the Center for Policing Equity to even improve that much more. I also think that there's just a general ethos. I ran for mayor, and I started the run, a year out. So and then even as a councilman, when I discovered that we were the blackest city in America, we're actually the blackest big city. There are some cities under 100,000 people that have, higher percentages. But and then even through the campaign that I ran, my slogan was Black, period, on purpose, period. So looking at how we could use policies that improve the lives. I'm a Movement for Black Lives Matter activist who was elected to office. So throughout the entire history, the 5-year history of our city, I have been talking about, and we've been infusing in just the very ethos of not only how we create policies, but even how we think of ourselves as a city. We know that the eyes of America are on us, and we want to be good examples, both as policymakers and as constituents. And I think that those things have really affected, it's an intangible that I would love for someone to come and study, but I think that those things have also had an effect on how we just conduct ourselves.
We've also seen this year, and coinciding with this, these mass shootings and high-profile shootings across the country, a lot of scrutiny has been placed on black mayors in major cities like Chicago and New York, Atlanta, Baltimore, and elsewhere. What do you think are some of the added challenges that you guys face being black mayors that mayors of other races may not have to deal with? How does it add to the or compound some of the political scrutiny that you receive on issues such as policing or just addressing issues of being a mayor of a major city?
Well, I think unfortunately you have a political slant in media as it relates to how it's actually portrayed around gun violence. Gun violence exists across the entire city. I mean, when I say city, I mean across the entire country. It doesn't just exist in urban cores in America. There are other forms of gun violence that exist in suburbia or rural as well. It's just that we're at a higher percentage as it relates to being in urban cores. I think the biggest challenge, though, because your question was the added pressure of being black mayors and the conversation around gun violence. There are things we can't solve and control for. So, for example, is in a state like Alabama, cities don't have home rule. And so there are measures I want to take to make people safer, but it goes against those legislators down at the state house who are so pro-gun rights that it doesn't actually save lives. In a state like Alabama, they've removed the permit law that I use locally to take off over 2,000 illegal guns a year. When you take that tool away from me to be in a position to address gun violence, but then you at the same time put a target on urban cores and say, as mayors, what are you doing about gun violence? Well, those two things don't align, and it goes against my position of literally doing everything I can to decrease gun violence in my community when I can't get state or federal help.
And I want to amplify two things that Mayor Woodfin said. One was about the media, and then one is about this issue of home rule and allocation of resources. So here in Georgia, we do have home rule ostensibly, but and what we have found is that our Republican-controlled legislature doesn't seem to believe in home rule in democratically controlled cities. Right, we saw that during the COVID pandemic when we were trying to do mask mandates and things like that to keep people safe, science-based intervention measures. But then we also see it. One of the things that I have talked about is that we cannot police our way to prosperity, right? And if you look at most municipal police budgets outside of probably New York City, most of us are spending 30 to 50% of our tax dollars on public safety. and you have someone like me come along, and we have all of these scientifically proven intervention methods that say that one of the best ways to reduce crime is to reduce income inequality. There's been a whole Nobel Prize winning study about that. And so if I'm saying as a mayor, let's take some of the money that we're spending on policing and then reinvest it into jobs programs or parks programs or, pre-arrest, whatever the items are, it becomes challenging, even in a city like ours where we've seen 3 years of double-digit decreases. It becomes challenging when newsrooms are still reporting about who got shot in South Fulton this week. We can do all of these amazing things. We are doing a bailout for Father's Day. Father's Day and Juneteenth are the same year this year. We can't get people to cover that. But if someone is shot, they will be so the media, the reporting by these newsrooms, which if we can just have a courageous conversation, very often are being run, the editors, the decision makers in these newsrooms that decide what is going to be in the A block or any of the blocks of the news are suburban white folks who already have a narrative in their head about what South Fulton or the South Side of any given city is. You get these news stories that do not match up with the data. It doesn't matter how much we say crime is decreasing. If every night you turn on the news and in the A block, they're talking about this one killing that happened on the South Side. And so that's been one of our biggest challenges. And I think, kind of stepping outside of what would be the normal purview of a mayor or even a city council is really calling for more diversity in newsrooms, particularly at the decision-making level.
Absolutely. One of the other, you guys touched on this a little bit, one of the more positive things that come out of the pandemic, which is still ongoing, but since 2020 has been this huge surge and focus on Black wealth building or wealth building in the Black community, promoting entrepreneurship in the Black community. We saw disproportionate effects on African-American businesses as it relates to the COVID lockdowns and the businesses shutting down, at much higher rates in Black and brown communities, but Black communities in particular. What changes this is a question for both of you. What changes are you guys implementing that will help support the growth of Black businesses and homeownership in your communities?
Well, Brother Mayor, you want to take that one first?
Sure. One is just telling the story, right, and making sure the facts are out there. The city of South Fulton has a 66% home ownership rate. It's one of the highest home ownership rates across the nation, across all ethnicities. We have a median income that is $10,000 higher than Atlanta. It's higher than most cities. And one of the things that I've been talking about is using those facts, right, in our position next to the world's busiest airport as the Blackest city in America to become the economic capital of the African diaspora internationally, right? So that is something that I want to position our city to do. We are in a film that is debuting in a couple of weeks at the Tribeca Film Festival called Rise and Rebuild, where we really talk about how South Fulton and some other cities are on the cutting edge of building Black wealth and creating policies that do that. So I think some of it is just being Black on purpose enough in our policy making that we are doing things that eliminate barriers to building wealth, such as access to capital, whether that means developing cryptocurrencies and finding new ways to get capital to entrepreneurs who've been traditionally locked out, or building our own credit union, just different programs that we can do to make it easier. We're also investing in small business incubators, but doing things that remove some of those institutional barriers that have existed to building Black wealth. Understanding that if we're doing that for African American entrepreneurs and for African American people who are usually at the bottom of so many of these statistics, that a rising tide lifts all boats, and that it will build, because you get these allegations of racism or reverse racism or whatever foolishness that is. But being able to say that by doing this, we are increasing the tax base and increasing the revenues for everyone in our city to enjoy.
So I think, just adding to what the mayor said, what we've attempted to do is first look within. I think we needed to know, as a city and a municipal local government, what are we doing with tax dollars to show that we believe in inclusion and diverse spending. That diverse spending is support of minority and women-owned and Black businesses. In order to do that, we needed to start with the disparity study. So I actually launched a disparity study. And this year, in 2022, we've just gotten those results. So as we come through those results, we know whatever that baseline is, it's unacceptable. But we're now in a position to go back to the community and implement intentional design programs to increase our spend prior to when I became mayor. Second thing, coupled with that, is a program I call VITAL, VITAL. I launched it back in 2019. The whole idea was to create a public report card for corporate Birmingham to voluntarily show to the community how much you spend on minority and women-owned businesses. We know that 10% was spent on minority-owned businesses back in 21. From July 19 to June 2020, 12% was women and minority-owned businesses received 24 million. So we want to continue to increase that number every year by challenging corporate Birmingham to put all your cards on the table. The whole idea is that I wanted to challenge major corporations to sign on to produce their spend reports in the wake of George Floyd's death, including organizations like Regions, Bank, UAB, which is the largest university in the state with 26,000 employees, a technology company called SHIP, and a company called Alabama Power as well. But what we got to do is not just hold ourselves accountable. We got to hold our corporate community accountable as well, as it relates to supporting minority and Black-owned businesses.
And if I could just pause for networking, Mayor Woodfin, we've been looking at doing a disparity study. I would love to get with you and your department to figure out like how you executed that, and when the results come out, that would be, I think, very instructive for us as well.
Absolutely.
Love it. We bring in some cohesion here and working and networking at the same time. I love it. So I wanted to point out, so today, this is according to the African American Mayors Association. There's more than a third of America's top 100 cities are governed by African Americans. As I mentioned earlier, we saw a huge wave of Black mayors elected post 2020. I wanted to just kind of ask you guys what your thoughts are on that increase, and how do we get more guys like yourselves running for office to become mayor? Was this something when you were growing up that you saw yourself doing? What was your inspiration? Talk a little bit about all of that, please.
So, I'll start present, then I'll go past. Present, cities like Shreveport, New Orleans, Jackson, Mississippi, Atlanta, Georgia, Charlotte, North Carolina, Richmond, Virginia, Washington, D.C., Chicago, as well as Compton and San Francisco and Topeka, Kansas, and Tacoma, Washington. These are just some of the cities I've named, right? So many that I've missed. Most of those cities I name are actually led by not just Black people, but strong Black women. So shout out to these Black women who are actually stepping up and leading their cities and communities. And I have the opportunity to work with them. And we talk via text, we talk via phone, we meet up at mayor's conferences, and we all have the same challenges. And so we all bounce best practices and solutions off each other because we all serve our communities. I think when I consider my past and how I got here, I knew from undergrad I wanted to serve my community from a public service standpoint. So I knew I wanted to be mayor. I didn't know the path to get there. But now being in this position, I can tell you, when we have, during the coronavirus, when you had governors fighting us when we didn't have the help at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue prior to Joe Biden as president, we leaned on each other. And I think that's what this job is really about, finding folk you can work with, talk with, and have best practices, learn best practices from to be a better mayor in your own personal community.
And for me, I was in 2015, I was a bus driver for MARTA, which is our city bus service. I was an aspiring singer. My mom told me to go get a good city job with benefits if I was going to pursue this music thing. And unfortunately, the MARTA, the city bus service, was trying to get out of their union contract with, bus drivers for things. We had, like many organized labor, I'd had the best health benefits and pension in my life, because of the union. And in outsourcing around that time, they made the decision. They got with some, bean counters at a consulting company, and they were like, you can get out of this contract if you outsource this department. And I saw hundreds of people lose their pension, lose their health benefits. Around that time, in 2015, there was this old white guy from Vermont who was running for president named Bernie Sanders, who was talking about how these corporations were getting out of control. And so, I started organizing with ATU 732. That was my local amalgamated transit union. From there, I went on to work with Leader Abrams. But at that same time in 2015, the murder of Mike Brown happened. And I assumed that in this supposed Black Mecca that Atlanta is, that we had already had a Black Lives Matter chapter. I found out that we didn't, and I became one of the founding members of the Atlanta chapter for Black Lives. In 2016, we really started thinking about a comprehensive platform to improve the lives of Black people that didn't just include policing, but it included affordable housing and entrepreneurship and access to capital and all of these other things, education. And what I found out as being a part of the development of that policy platform was that many of the things that we were in the streets and that we cared most about were not problems that would be solved at the federal level or even the state level, right? Whether your police department can enter with a no-knock warrant and shoot you in your sleep, those decisions are made by city council and by your city police department or your county police department. So we passed a no-knock, we ended no-knock warrants here in the city of South Fulton. Who decides what affordable housing is in your city and if it's going to be built? Those things happen at the city level. What our children are being taught about ourselves and our history, those things are decided at the local level. And so I say, to everyone, the things that you care the most about are probably being decided right down the street from your house by people whose meetings you can go to and whose offices you can go in and meet. Everyone can't fly to New York and meet, President Biden or even their congressperson, but your city council person who has control over a lot of those things and decisions over a lot of those things, you can walk right into their offices at City Hall and you can go to every city council meeting and speak directly to the policymakers. And so that's how I get involved. And I've spent quite a bit of my time these 5 years in office recruiting other young people to run. And I think what we're seeing is that there's an entire generation of us that have been protesting since 2015, and we're now moving as did the generations before us in SNCC. We model ourselves after the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Movement for Black Lives, and we are following that same path that John Lewis and others took into political office to be the change we want to see.
You talked about some of the protest movement that has been taking place over the last several years. There was so much goodwill that was extended from the business community, public and private sector in the aftermath of 2020. The conversation, as you guys have noted, has shifted quite a bit, both at the local and the national level. Are you concerned at all that we're losing progress on issues such as police reform, addressing issues of racial equity? Are you concerned that conversation, and especially We're looking across the country now. It seems like, almost like we're going back to the 90s where everybody's concerned about crime being rampant and so-called super predators and things of that nature. Are you concerned about that? And what are you doing to try to not to avoid us being taken backwards on these issues of reform?
So I just think in our positions as mayors, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. Police reform and accountability measures as it relates to your officers does not contradict police enforcement and being aggressive against tackling gun violence. Those two things are not in opposition of each other. We can reform our police departments. We can hold our officers accountable. We can put policies in place that make sure our officers don't harm people. And at the same exact time, do everything we can from an enforcement standpoint that is supported by reentry and prevention measures to support tackling gun violence. I think a lot of people want mayors to choose between the two. And I think people forget that at the root of some of what we do as mayors, you strip down our responsibilities. It comes down to two things: public safety and public infrastructure with your tax dollars. Nope, you can't give that job to somebody else. You can't supplant or outsource public safety and public infrastructure. Mayors are ultimately responsible for those two things. And so when you unpack that, what that simply means is under public safety, hold your officers accountable, but also know because you are an employer, you have to, a large percentage of your budget is their salary, it's their wages, it's their benefits, it's their uniforms, it's their equipment, it's their technology, it's their vehicles. And so in Birmingham, there's not a slush fund we have. These dollars go to make sure that the officers are responding to the actual number one request. And so while there are a lot of voices that say reform the police, we say yes to. There are a lot of voices that say defund the police, but there's a whole nother crowd out here that doesn't make the news. And their number one request is, I want more police presence. They request more police. And so as mayors, what we have to do is drown out the noise and balance all of the above that I just stated.
I think I'm going to say something a little different. Because I've heard that too in our city, and I think that it's important as elected officials when we hear people asking for things that we listen for what they are really asking for. And I think very often when people are saying that they want more police, what they're really saying is that they want to feel more safe. And I am not sure that increasing the number of police always makes us feel safer. And that very often when we're increasing the number of police, whether it's in our schools or in our streets, we are increasing the flow of the school to prison pipeline and the brain drain of Black genius from our communities. What I would say to and this is a courageous conversation I would have with people in any city where they feel like they are losing momentum, you have to look at yourselves as voters and who you put into office. Here in Atlanta, after, I'm in South Fulton, but in Atlanta, after the murder of Rayshard Brooks at that Wendy's in that video that everyone saw, the district attorney lost their job. And we had a mayor's race the following year, and the mayor that was only talking tough on crime did not win that election because the voters here decided they were ready to try a different approach. Here in South Fulton, I led for Father's Day in 2020 in the middle of a pandemic, maybe 2019, 2020, we led a Black Fathers Matter March for Father's Day. And I led it as a council person. We had Black police officers who were fathers who were in that march. And so our community saw its leadership saying, what was happening was wrong and that we need to find a different way forward to make our community safer. And so if you are in a city that is continuing to pursue a strategy that has been failing for decades, then it is up to you as voters to elect a different set of leadership who is ready to try something new. Insanity is doing the same thing and expecting different results. It's also insanity to keep electing the same people who have brought you no different results.
Excellent. You guys, one other thing we want to touch on as we run this down a little bit is you guys both mayors in the South. We've seen earlier this year that a leaked Supreme Court memo, or opinion, I should say, that indicates that Roe v. Wade is about to be overturned, possibly. It's still obviously legal to get an abortion across the country, but this is an issue that disproportionately affects Black women, particularly in the South. I wanted to get your thoughts on some of the health disparities that currently exist. We've seen this perpetuated throughout the pandemic as Black people have been disproportionately impacted by COVID. First and foremost, just your thoughts on the current state of affairs as it relates to abortion rights in your communities and in your states, and what if Roe is indeed overturned, what you guys might do locally or to promote women's reproductive health and things of that nature in your communities.
Well, I think men need to shut up. That's what I think. I'm not a woman. I'm not going to even put myself in a position to have an opinion on what the woman does or does not do with her body. I don't believe I have room to do that. And I think laws that infringe upon a woman's choice, her privacy, issues and concerns with her health and her doctor should be with her. It should not be with me. I mean, it definitely should not be with our courts. This issue was settled many, many years ago. And the fact that this has been a fight all these years and we've gotten to this point is just very concerning to me, and it's scary. It's scary because I believe that men continue to do things that find ways to suppress women and attempt to control them. And I think this is another area that's just a very slippery slope and dangerous to the ultimate health of women and what decisions they choose to make. I think overall, what we need, and the mayor has said this word more than once today, courageous conversations. We need courageous leaders at all levels. What's happening is we forget how important local municipal government is until another innocent Black person is killed. And that's when mayors get the most attention about what you're doing about police reform and accountability. We forget the whole point and the importance of the third branch and the judicial branch of government to when a decision is made to possibly overturn Roe v. Wade, and we realize the people we put in Congress actually matters. And so I hope this is a wake-up call during this election cycle, a general election, for people to be motivated to put people in office who only want to pass laws that actually protect and help people and don't hurt them.
And I will say that and say, first, I want to say that I am a Christian, and my reading of the Bible has taught me that God gave both the blessing and the burden of childbirth to women. And I was raised by a woman who told me repeatedly, I brought you into this world and I'll take you out. So I am going to trust God, and I'm going to trust women as well. I will say one of the things that I am doing to combat this is, one, I am supporting one of the only abortion clinics on the South Side, which happens to be in my district. And I am going to work to make sure that Georgia's next governor is a Black woman. And then lastly, I would say, I think that we've got to challenge those folks on the other side that want to talk about the value and the sanctity of life, and remind them that life does not end at birth. So if we are really talking about creating a culture of life, then we need to be looking at creating a universal healthcare system, universal pre-K, ending income inequality, so that children that are born in South Fulton or Mississippi or wherever under this new law, that those mothers and those children have support throughout their lives, not just having them be forced into the world and given no social safety net to help care for the children that are now here.
Okay, guys, I could continue this all day, but unfortunately we are out of time. I want to thank both of you, Mayors Woodfin and Kamau, for joining us here today. I want to wish you guys a happy early Juneteenth as we prepare for that celebration coming up in the next couple of weeks. And congrats on your success so far, and good luck to you guys on your continued success this summer and in the future.
Thank you
Thank
all.
you.
South Fulton forever.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I am Simone Sebastian, Editorial Director at Capital B. I'm thrilled that you all have joined us for this conversation about Black political leadership. And I am joined here by Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes of Wisconsin, currently running for U.S. Senate. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Hey, Simone, thank you so much for the invitation. Really excited to have a chance to talk to you.
Great, very excited as well. All right, well, let's just start off with the big question so folks can get to know you a little bit. You are coming from a blue collar background and have made your way into politics. Can you tell us what got you into politics in the first place and what are the big issues that you're looking to solve?
Well, absolutely. My background is very blue collar. My dad worked third shift on an assembly line. My mother was a public school teacher. My story is a very, very Wisconsin story. I don't come from wealth by any means. I don't come from a politically or well-connected family. I grew up right in the heart of the city of Milwaukee. And the jobs that my parents had were the ticket to the middle class. And that's important to me because I wouldn't be able to sit here in this position as lieutenant governor or as a candidate for the United States Senate if it were not for that blue collar middle class upbringing. I got to learn what hard work actually meant, got to live a very real world experience. And I think that's what's missing from our politics. I think that's what's missing from government, especially from our highest offices. And that was the major reason I decided to run for the state assembly, then run for lieutenant governor, because there was a perspective that was just missing, a very real world experience of so many people, not just in the city of Milwaukee, but all across the state with similar upbringings that is often, way too often left out of the conversation.
Great. And so kind of speaking of Midwest, rural, blue collar upbringing, agriculture and farming has been a large part of your platform and of your politics, which I think is very interesting. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how that became a focus for you and what you're looking to do in that area.
Well, that's the thing. My background isn't even rural at all. I was born in the city of Milwaukee, but I think it's so important to spend time in rural communities, especially throughout this campaign. I think that I have a unique opportunity, especially serving in the office of lieutenant governor and building more bridges. Like there's this disconnect. A lot of politicians, out of touch politicians will use it and create unnecessary divides. And those divides only set us all further backwards. When I show up in rural communities, I talk about Milwaukee issues. And in the city of Milwaukee, I talk about rural issues because we're all connected. At the end of the day, people want good schools to send their children to. People want a job that puts food on the table, and people want to be able to go to a doctor and not worry about a surprise bill. But unfortunately, that's not the reality for far too many people. When my granddad moved to Milwaukee after serving in World War II, the city of Milwaukee was the best place for a Black family. We had the strongest Black middle class, and today it's the exact opposite. And that's why it's so important that we come together to talk about how quality of life in Milwaukee has been declining at almost the same rate as it has been in rural communities as well. Our rural communities, our farmers are experiencing loss of family farms at an unprecedented rate because of these corporate monopolies that have been making it harder for our family farms to compete. Now, the factory where my granddad worked is nothing now. It sits empty. The factory where my dad worked, it's a strip mall now. Those same tickets to the middle class just don't exist anymore at the same level. And I tell you, I heard Barack Obama give his DNC speech in 2004. he talked about his unique story and his unlikely path, but it was still an American story. And it's something that so many people can relate to. I started out in organizing, bringing communities together. And I still see myself as an organizer of sorts, still working to bring communities together because we're so much stronger together. And all of us have been left behind. And it won't be until we come together acknowledging that we've all been left behind, putting aside those differences and really focusing on the things that unite us that will be more powerful than we could have ever imagined. And that's what excites me. That's what I get up every day thinking about. And when I travel out, regardless of how far away I am from my own hometown, it's a message that I share far and wide, and it's been pretty effective.
So you brought up Obama, who you've spoken about as an inspiration for you in politics. One of the things that was a struggle during his presidency, and even prior to that, was balancing, kind of racial progress and improving life for Black Americans, balancing that against, wide backlash to some of those policies and ideas. And so I was hoping you could talk about how you do balance those things on a national stage. How do you center Black constituencies, without sparking some pushback?
Well, that's the thing. A lot of people didn't see Barack Obama coming. He wasn't a typical politician. And, I don't check the box of what a typical politician looks like either. But I do know my community very well. I know the broader community very well. And I know that we all deserve better than what we've been getting. And having that experience outside of my own hometown, outside of my own community, again, I'm reminded every day that the issues, the challenges that we're all faced with can be more easily overcome when we do it together. We'll take some of the most pressing issues in Wisconsin, like Black male incarceration. We have the highest rate of Black male incarceration in the state of Wisconsin. And that's an issue that I carry regardless of where I am. I don't talk about it in a different way when I'm in a different part of the state, because over incarceration is costing the entire state. It's costing our entire country. But in terms of Wisconsin specifically, I show up and I say, well, the amount of money that we're spending on our prison system, as an example, while at the same time we see school funding continuously decline, we see infrastructure spending continuously decline, but yet we're able to spend so much money on incarceration, a little closer to $40,000 per inmate. Do you realize that if we were smarter on crime, if we did the work to prevent people from going to prison in the first place, if we truly address mental health issues, substance abuse issues, which has ravaged rural communities, we will be in a much better place together as a whole. So talking about these things is, a lot of people would have push you in a different direction. We'll say 10 years ago in a campaign, they would have said, well, these aren't the things to talk about. It's not going to work. You need to talk about this thing and this thing only, and push everything to the side. But when you push these issues to the side, you push people to the side. You push potential supporters to the side, potential voters, important blocks of folks who feel like they have been left behind and their concerns aren't being heard. So it's a balance, yes, but in the position of lieutenant governor, we're taking on all the issues of the state. And we would be foolish to not acknowledge the realities of people's lives all over, whether it's an issue like Black male incarceration, or whether it is the opportunity gap that exists within education, the stark difference between outcomes of Black and white students in our schools. It's important for us to have those discussions, because we're only better when we all do better.
Okay, I want to move on to issues of environment. Now, I understand you're the chair for the governor's task force on climate change. You've made environmental issues also part of your platform. And yet Wisconsin has some of the highest disparities in terms of air pollution between white and Black Wisconsinites, if that's the right term.
That's the nicest, right? You got it.
I got it. But I was hoping you could just talk about that. Why do those disparities continue to exist in your mind, and what are the solutions to them?
So again, it comes to communities being left behind. It also comes to communities being intentionally disregarded, whether it is Black, brown neighborhoods, low income neighborhoods. The reality is there's been so much environmental harm because people feel like they can just get away with anything because there's limited political power in these communities. Now, during my time in organizing, one of the biggest issues we took, actually, one of the first and biggest issues we took on by the time I got there was an energy provider, a utility company that was using coal burning power plants, and these coal burning power plants were obviously in the most vulnerable communities. And I say obviously because there's no way that more affluent communities would have put up with that. And the impact of these coal burning power plants resulted in respiratory illnesses at a disproportionate rate for Black and brown and low income children. And so together, the organization I worked with, which was an interfaith coalition, joined with environmental groups, joined with other social justice organizations, and we took on a utility company, and we won because it was discovered the unfair practices, things people already knew. This happens all the time. Like we already knew this stuff. The political power just wasn't there to make a difference. But that's what organizing means to me. That's why organizing is so important, because people who may have seemed or felt powerless on their own became strong with a united front. And with that issue of disproportionate rates of respiratory illnesses, that's just one instance. This is happening in so many other places as well. It's one of the main reasons I took on environmental justice and issues of climate change. I had asthma growing up. I was born in one of the lowest income zip codes in our entire state. And a lot of other people who had similar situations they were experiencing and dealing with. And so environmental justice has been incredibly important. Air quality, water quality, you name it. And also another thing too, which is an environmental justice issue, is food access. We grow a whole lot of food here in Wisconsin, but unfortunately, we still find food deserts in communities. And this is a story that can be told all across the country as well. It's a shame that, our state is we produce the second, or excuse me, we have the second most organic farms in the entire country. We're talking about fresh, healthy food that's being grown 100 miles away from communities that are in desperate need. So we've been doing the work to connect the dots. We have been doing some farm to table and farm to school work to get fresh, healthy food on in the kitchen of people who wouldn't have otherwise had access. One of the things I'm most proud of is the huge disparity that could have easily been solved a long time ago, but our administration took the lead, and we've been on the forefront of making sure that health access, health equity is something we'll lead with as a state.
So speaking of farmers again, I know you've spent quite a bit of time talking to the farmers of Wisconsin. I'm wondering what you hear from Black farmers out there in particular, and the particular issues that they're dealing with. Access to loans, the general support that, others in their industry might have easier access to. It's another area of disparity in Wisconsin in particular. So what are you hearing from them?
So access thing, and it's an important one, and that's an issue whether we're talking about farms, whether we're talking about home loans, whatever the case may be, business loans. But one of the bigger realities too in farming is the access to land. It is almost impossible to start out as a new farmer. Now, we don't have a whole bunch of Black farmers here in Wisconsin. We do have a number of them. We have a number of urban farms as well. People who have been taking unused plots of lands right in the heart of the city and putting that land to work to, one, help increase that food access, but also teach new valuable skills to people who wouldn't have otherwise considered any place in agriculture. So with that being said, the access to capital is something that, of course, touches Black farmers, just like Black people who would like to start businesses or people who want to go on to own a home. But the land part is one of the most concerning because it's so expensive to get in. It is so expensive, and almost it feels unrealistic to people is what I've been told.
Yeah. So what are the policy solutions for that, that land access in particular?
Yeah, so the land access piece, I think that one of the biggest things we could do to help increase that access is to, one, make sure the loans are accessible for people. Also, one other thing we could do is incentivize growing healthy food, as an example. Like the farm bill is so messed up right now. And the reason why people are being priced out is what I talked about earlier with the large corporate monopolies that have made it harder for smaller farms to compete, but it has also made it even more difficult for people to get into business in the first place. And we're talking about operations that are incentivized for growing what just becomes animal feed or food product. You know, the farm bill is more geared towards, we'll say, corn, soybean, wheat, like these commodity crops, which we need them. But at the end of the day, there's also a need for fresh, healthy food. And this is an area where up and coming Black farmers can have an opportunity to participate, to have an opportunity to be providers all across the state and all across the country. And we need to do more to incentivize these up and coming operations rather than the large corporate monopolies who already are making out like bandits, who already are very financially stable and well off, I would say.
So I want to touch on another issue that has been an issue. I was going to say, is a big issue now. It's always been a big issue, but has come into the forefront with some recent tragedies, being gun violence. And this is at the forefront of conversations in Congress, and should you win, I think will be a big issue for you as well as a senator. So I'd like to hear a little bit about your thoughts on how America breaks through the gridlock to make some real change in terms of gun violence. And we're talking beyond the kind of school mass shootings, not to minimize that at all, but obviously gun violence in America, and particularly as it affects Black people, is much larger than that. So we'd love to hear your thoughts there.
For every instance of gun violence, whether it's the one-off that happens all the time or a mass shooting, for every instance that goes unaddressed, for every time a person experiences the pain of gun violence without any real change fundamentally, without any real structural change, every day that happens, we see other countries step up, fill the leadership void, and provide an example of what the United States of America can do. We are the only country that experiences gun violence at this rate. We are the only country that chooses to do nothing in the wake of it. The common sense approach is there. Overwhelming majority of people in this country, overwhelming majority of gun owners support universal background checks. There's no reason Congress hasn't enacted universal background checks as the law of the land. Red flag laws that will help prevent a lot of these killings as well, and getting these weapons of war off of our street, banning assault weapons, high capacity magazines. There's no reason that people have such easy access to these weapons that are reserved for the battlefield. These weapons are in our communities, and it is causing causing unnecessary harm, violence, and creating fear. I personally, this is not political for me. I don't even see this as a policy issue or a policy stance. I've dealt with gun violence. My first friend I lost was my freshman year in high school to gun violence, then lost another my sophomore year in high school to gun violence. And this is a cycle that repeated itself many times over, most recently in 2018. And it's a pain that, I hope nobody ever has to experience. But I'll say that in the United States Senate and Congress itself, there aren't enough people who understand the reality of gun violence. They see it on the news, they hear about it. They may even be contacted by their constituents, but knowing that pain firsthand is an experience that we desperately need in Congress. And I'm not saying I don't want anybody to ever have to experience it, but the people who have dealt with it before, having to go to funerals for your friends as a kid, that's ridiculous. It's a shame. And the United States has a real responsibility that they have abdicated. This country has abdicated its responsibility to keep people safe, and we need to do something about it.
So let's say you get into Senate. Of course, it takes more than one person, but given the reality of the challenge that we've seen for Congress to actually do something. What change do you make? What efforts does one make once in position to make some real progress there?
I'm so glad you brought up we need more than one, because we do need more than one. We need 51. We need 51 US senators who are going to be, I won't even say being bold, because this is not a bold stance. The majority of people support this. This is just properly representing the people you were elected to serve. So it's not a bold stance to take on gun violence, but it is a necessary one. And it's one that too many people are refusing to actually answer the call to. And so we need 51 people who get it, 51 people who won't be bought off by the gun lobby, 51 people who are going to stand firm and truly address this issue as the public health crisis that it is. So yes, we certainly need more than one. We need 51.
So let's talk about that. I think that's a good segue to the election itself. And, as a progressive politician, this the midterms are not expected to be an easy road for those on the left. What is it that you think constituents need to hear, voters need to hear or want to hear from you and from those on the left to feel like they should, give the progressive politics a chance this year?
So the thing is, whether it's the left, center, or the right, people in Wisconsin are going to vote for the person they feel has their best interest, the person they feel will fight for them, the person they feel will improve their quality of life, will make it easier for them to put food on the table. Unfortunately, one of the biggest problems we have is a politics of just division, a politics of only stating how bad the opponent is without giving people a reason to vote for us. And that's why we are showing up in so many places. That's why we have such a footprint in rural Wisconsin. That's why we have such a footprint in urban centers in Milwaukee. That's why we have such a footprint in suburban communities, because we show up and remind people every day that this is a fight worth fighting, and it's a fight that we will take on, and we won't give up until we win. We talk about our plan to drive down costs. We talk about our plan to make sure that every person in this country can see a doctor without worrying about a surprise bill. We talk about a plan to protect air and water quality, the things we should be able to take for granted in the most wealthy nation in this entire country. When I talk to folks, they are tired of billionaire class, ultra wealthy people who have been in control of the economy and in control of their politics, while their lives get so much harder. Over the course of this pandemic, billionaire wealth increased an additional $1.5 trillion. At the same time, around 7 million people found themselves in poverty for the first time. Inequality is destroying us from within. And this is an issue that impacts every single community in our state. People don't want a handout. People just want a fair shot. And it's up to us to deliver that fair shot, to take on those power structures that make it harder for communities to be able to thrive.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. And best of luck.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
All right.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being with us here at Capitol B Fest. This last conversation we're going to have is a very important one about economics and wealth in the Black community. I'm joined by Professor Darrick Hamilton. Darrick, thank you so much for joining me.
I am so pleased to be here and be in conversation with you. It has been a while since we talked, but I'm a huge admirer and been keeping up with your work for a long time, and it really is an honor.
Well, likewise, and I'm so excited to have this conversation, particularly for this audience at Capitol B. It has been a crazy couple of years for the economy, and it looks like things are continuing. So I really want to start by doing a little bit of scene setting there. So as we dive in, what did the pandemic do to Black Americans' wealth?
Well, we don't have the data yet on what the impact of the pandemic will be on Black Americans' wealth, but history tells us and common sense tells us that it's going to be detrimental and probably catastrophic. We know that during economic downturns, those that are worse going into the economic downturn in terms of economic viability get hit the hardest. And in some ways, the gap emerges even larger because in a I guess an unjust sense, those with capital that are able to withstand it, not only are they able to withstand it, but they are able to buy asset prices on the cheap. So they take advantage of the low prices, and then coming out of the recession after we have the stimulus and we're back on a trajectory of growth, those that were worse going in are worse off. Those that were not end up even better off.
So is that kind of what we saw? There were so many stories during the pandemic about how millionaires and billionaires were actually becoming richer as the pandemic went on. And meanwhile, we were seeing, job loss, a lot of like economic softness for folks. People couldn't work, especially in the service industry, et cetera, et cetera. Is that kind of what we're seeing?
Absolutely. And the grounding of it all is power. The grounding of it all is the ability to take advantage because you have economic and political might to begin with. But I will say there's perhaps some silver lining. If we look at this reaction to the economic downturn compared to the reaction to the Great Recession, I suspect that as a result of the government leveraging large sums of resources in a quick way and not sending it directly to corporations with the expectation that it'll trickle down, but stimulus checks going directly to ordinary Americans in a progressive way, I think did soften or dampen some of the effects in the long-term detriments that would have occurred otherwise if we would have pursued our typical responses.
And we're talking about some of those direct payments, which were, not never seen before, but kind of novel, at least in this time period. There were some for childcare or some for having children. There were some that were stimulus that were based on income and earnings for the household. Do we have any data yet on what those direct payments to families did?
I mean, if we think about child poverty, that information came out with regards to the refundable child tax cut. And I can't remember the exact number, but I'm sure that we reduced child poverty by more than a third. But here's the problem. We stopped. I mean, it's something that worked. And then almost overnight, child poverty increases because we stopped. And Jillian, let me add one other point that came about from this intervention compared to previous interventions. Not only do I think the policy was better in that when you direct stimulus directly to our most treasured resource, which is people, it has the direct impact on their lives. And then you get the multiplying effect in a more just way. But we changed narratives. So the notion that we couldn't send checks directly to Americans, well, we did. So the notion that we couldn't invest directly into people, we saw that we actually can do that.
Yeah. So where are we now? I know we can't conflate like income or jobs directly with wealth, but just wondering, we talk about that recovery, especially for Black people, that was a little bit better than what we saw coming out of the Great Recession. How are Black communities doing on unemployment, wages, all of those things?
So in terms of unemployment, sadly, that 2-to-1 ratio, that magic is not the right word, that dismal 2-to-1 ratio where whatever the unemployment rate is generally for white people, the Black rate is generally twice as high. And that occurs across demographics when we think about education, when we think about age. So the unemployment rate for white people now is relatively low, not relatively low, it's historically low, 3.2%. But the Black rate is still twice as high, 6%. And unemployment doesn't capture it all. I mean, we had a new term that came about from this pandemic, essential workers. And that's a euphemism. It's a euphemism for workers that don't have power to control their destiny and basically are at risk because of certain work conditions where they were even vulnerable to the pandemic with losing their lives. And we know the makeup of essential workers. Essential workers were overrepresented by women and overrepresented by Black people and Latinx people. And there were certain sectors that had greater representation of essential workers. But even in those sectors that had greater representation of essential workers, the distribution between who had better paying jobs was racialized, was genderized. So that was a long-winded answer to say that beyond unemployment, we have workers that aren't able to engage in the workplace without risk and with proper wages also, and that's extremely racialized.
Yeah. So what this is all leveling up to for me is this conversation that we've been having for so long about the racial wealth gap. So one, I wanted you to just give a quick context to why we talk about wealth as being so important, and kind of where we've been in that really persistent gap between the wealth that white families have and the wealth that Black families have.
You know, to sum up the essentialness of wealth is that it's functional. It is an input. It is power. In America, we like to use terms like choice, freedom, agency. If we were to find one economic indicator that affords people the greatest financial agency in their lives, as well as the greatest economic security, that would be wealth. You know, wealth allows you to do big things. Wealth allows you to make decisions. If you are a worker and you come up with some brilliant idea, well, however brilliant that idea may be, if you don't have capital, you can't realize that idea. So wealth provides the financial agency to reap the rewards of your ingenuity, of your efforts in a fundamental way that income simply doesn't.
Yeah. And what was the last kind of gap that you remember? What was the size of that? It was white Americans' wealth was X times that of Black families.
Yeah. And you know how stable this is? I can say it and not even know the exact number and be pretty confident that I'm right. And that's a big problem. It generally is 10 to 1. I think the more recent estimates going into the pandemic was about it was about 13 to 1. Like I think 13 cents on the dollar I'm sorry, not 13 to 1, 13 cents on the dollar for a Black person. So for every dollar held in wealth by a white person, the typical Black person had about 13 cents. And you know, one other point to make, we're talking about median. So we're talking about what is typical rather than averages. If we use averages, the gap's going to be much more dramatic, but it would be slightly unfair to present the number in averages because we have multiple problems with wealth distributions in America. We have simply a concentration of wealth where so few people control most of the nation's wealth that is dysfunctional. So the bottom 50% of households, Black or white, own about 2% of the nation's wealth. The top 10% own over 75% of the nation's wealth. So that's dysfunctional, period. Now, of course, that top 10% is overwhelmingly white, but it still leaves out a lot of white Americans. But what becomes, you know, more dastardly is that one's race is more predictive of their wealth position than income, education, or any other demographic that we can name. So being Black in and of itself, I can generally predict with a high level of confidence that you're pretty much a low to no wealth person.
And why is that, right? So we've seen in the past several decades, several generations, some level of progress in civil rights, some level of progress in educational attainment, and thus in job attainment. So why is it that this seems to not close the gap at all, even as Black people achieve these other things, raise their income, do all of these other things?
Yeah, I mean, if we consider the ways in which wealth is generated, I think there lies the answer. The way that wealth is generated, it is wealth that begets more wealth. So basically having capital provides people with the ability to invest in an asset that will, and here's the key word, passively appreciate over their life. They don't have to do anything if they get themselves into the right investment. Now, I don't want to use too much hyperbole and say that there's no effort and no ingenuity involved in wealth, but for the most part, the most critical ingredient is capital. And Black people throughout American history, not only have they not been privileged by the policy apparatus that afforded white people access to some capital foundation. But if we go all the way back to slavery, they literally were a capital asset for a white landowning plantation class. But then here's the other element. You know, we talk about wealth a lot of ways in economics as capital, but over the years, some self-realization for me through, I guess, study and experience is that the other key element is political codification. So when Black people have been able to overcome their circumstances and despite, odds, be overachievers and accumulate modicums of wealth or capital. It's never had the political protections, the property rights that's been bestowed upon white people. They've always been vulnerable to predation and then outright terror, in addition to fraud, in addition to other malfeasance, they literally would be exposed to violence. So not only has their property not been protected, even their bodies. I'm rambling. I'm going to stop in a second, but we talked. George Floyd brought a lot of attention, and not only George Floyd, the documentation of the police brutality and murders of Black people brought a lot of attention to the issues of race. And then, fortunately, a lot of people that were involved in that political movement made the connection and link that it wasn't just violence, but it was also linked to our economic circumstance. And that to me was a nice, important realization and put us on a different trajectory, because literally the free mobility throughout society without the psychological and physical threat of violence certainly has an impact on one's capability to generate economic security.
Yeah. So going off that, I want to get into what some of the solutions are, or what some of the things that we think could actually narrow this gap are. So we know that it's not, getting that six-figure job. That's not going to make a huge difference. We know it's not, not getting your big iced coffee or whatever every morning. It's like not those small lifestyle decisions, or even like the big lifestyle decisions that you make about, I'm going to take this job over this job. Those don't actually end up begetting wealth in a way that allows us to narrow that gap. So one of the things that I thought has been so interesting through the pandemic is the shift that we've seen about the conversation, as you said, about policy and what the government is doing and what the government can do here, and their role really in narrowing this gap, which when you think about it makes a ton of sense, because policy, rights, freedom, and all of those things are what created this gap in the first place. So I'm wondering at this juncture, what are the policies, systems that you have studied or that you are looking at that you think could actually narrow this gap going forward?
Yeah, and I'll lead that answer with the other realization that politics, economics, and identity stratification have never been separable. Or I could state it differently. Policy, values, and the ways in which we define some people as deserving and undeserving all are iteratively linked. So I can come up with some really good policies, and others can as well. But if we really want transformation, we need a value shift in America. And this is not pie in the sky. This is not saying that, people say, well, how are we going to get people to be empathetic, and how are we going to get people to desire investments in humanity and solidarity? The same way we push narratives that have convinced people that their self-interest is the panacea for a thriving economy in and of itself. I dare say that solidarity is as much a human ethic as much as selfishness. It's a question of investments and what are we going to name as our priorities. So that'd be thing one. But to answer your question more directly, capital. To answer your question more directly, we need only look at history and see, well, how did white people generate a white asset-based middle class? And again, I don't want to state that white people aren't vulnerable today, but if we look back to our history with great programs like the New Deal that came out with the GI Bill that provided people capital to go to college without debt, the GI Bill that helped provide a down payment, FHA loans that reorganized the structure by which people could purchase a home in a long-term way at not exuberant cost because of interest rates that were subsidized. The Homestead Act that literally was a giveaway. These were examples of American policy that provided capital investments in people, not giveaways, investments in people that led to a thriving economy, and firms benefited too. I can give the long-winded answer that talks about growth and the productivity associated with that growth and the distribution. But needless to say, those were perhaps America's glory days. But I'm missing a key element, and that is it was done in a what's the word? In a racist way. Black people were denied access in terms of the design of the policy, the management of the policy, and the distribution of the policy. And so, again, long-winded answer, the lessons from those policies was when America invests in its greatest resource, it can not only facilitate them, it could lead to a better, more efficient, thriving economy. So today, we need to do it in an anti-racist way. Today, we need to make sure that we implement policies that are intentionally inclusive. Baby bonds is one example. A birthright to capital, saying that being born, the government will set aside an endowment for you based on the family position in which you're born, that when you become a young adult, you can invest in a home, you can invest in an education without debt, you can start a business or roll it over in a retirement account. And these are policies that can facilitate an asset-based middle class. I could say more, but let me pause. I feel like I'm talking a lot.
No, that was great. I was going to ask you about baby bonds. The other things I was going to ask you about, so you said the word giveaway, and that automatically triggered the conversation that we're hearing around student loan debt right now. Since Biden ran for president, and he was not the only one who talked about this, but he was elected, one of the things that was talked about during the election and since has been the forgiveness of some or all federal student loan debt. Student loans have been on pause for quite some time during the pandemic. I know me and a lot of people I know who spent a lot of money getting degrees so that we could get better jobs, have definitely reaped the benefits of that. And we know that there's also a disproportionate way that Black families are affected by student loan debt versus white families. What would student loan debt relief do for the wealth gap and for Black families in general?
Yeah, and I'm going to lead with the value. It's immoral that in the 21st century, we tell people, young people in particular, make something better of your life. Go to school and get educated. And then we saddle them with the albatross of debt. We render them indentured to some lender where that the rewards to their income, a big portion goes down to paying debt. So we can certainly afford to provide the right to an education without debt all the way through college. And again, I'm leading with the value. That should be a value. Economic rights is another way to change narratives. But that said, thinking about some of the economic spillover effects, I'll give a little more context. Millennials came of age during the last Great Recession, and then they were hit with a double whammy of this pandemic recession. And during that Great Recession, where we wiped away a lot of the wealth of millennial families, they were told to wait out the recession by going to college. And then we saddled them with record levels of debt. Give you some more statistics. Millennials have lower home ownership rates than every generation dating as far back as the greatest generation, which entered their young adulthood right after the Great Depression. So this is some hard data. Now, I haven't added the racial dimension. The racial gap in home ownership amongst millennials is larger than any generation since we've been tracking home ownership inequality throughout time. So not only as a generation are they hurt, Black millennials in particular will be hurt due to no fault of their own. They came of age during this Great Recession and during this pandemic, and we can do something about it. So canceling student debt to me is a first step and a righteous, just step. And then for Black people, we tell them, again, the narrative, personal politics of personal responsibility, invest in yourself, go to college. Some of the for-profit narratives are even predatory. Get up off that couch. You can come down today and be enrolled in our college if you take out these loans. Not talking about the returns on that education. In fact, here's another attribute of being Black. The returns to our education, the returns to our entrepreneurship are less than that of a white person, and that's empirically demonstrated. when I look at a college-educated Black person compared to a college-educated white person, the economic returns to them are not only lower, but it's lower than in comparison to every other education group. In other words, the disparities rise with education. So, all of that said, canceling the student loan debt is the right thing to do. And the notion of canceling 10,000 or even 50,000 has differential racial impacts. The typical debt for a Black college graduate 4 years after graduating is about $53,000. For a white person, it's closer to $30,000, which is still problematic, but it's really problematic for that Black person. So, yeah.
I mean, it's staggering. I mean, the last thing I want to ask about is reparations. It's been a buzzword since that big article that Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote, but it's been a conversation economically and politically for such a long time. It's just kind of getting resonance with everyday Americans now. I mean, what would reparations do? What would reparations look like in a way that would meaningfully change the wealth gap? Or is that kind of wrapped into everything we've been talking about?
Yeah, and I see reparations as a complement to a lot of the programs we've been talking about. So, a lot of the conversation is all we need is reparations. Well, that's a little myopic because it ignores what capital does. If we were to get it right and get reparations right, going forward, capital consolidates, it excludes, and it iterates. So what baby bonds does is it's a prospective policy to ensure more egalitarian distribution of capital going forward. But reparations is necessary. Reparations is necessary whether today is the political moment or tomorrow is the political moment. It's necessary for a variety of reasons. It is the most direct and parsimonious way to redress the racial wealth gap, period. It is. If you literally just offer the resources in a way to redress it, then that has that direct effect. It also has the truth and reconciliation component. And Jillian, what we've been talking about from the beginning is that you can't separate race from politics, from economics. They're all wrapped together. So the narratives, our ability to put forth good policies that affect both Black and white people, require a truth and reconciliation, require the US government to take account, recognize, and tell the truth about the ways in which distribution has come to be sorted today, the immoral ways, and take responsibility of that, because then we will ground poverty not in deficit amongst people, not in deficit behaviors or attitude, but deficits in what the deficit should be in, which is resource deprivation. So that's necessary. So reparations, and when will it occur? Who knows? The Overton moment of when the nation will be ready to take that reckoning and actually do that just work, I can't predict it, but I'm committed to justice because it's the right thing to do. And for political strategy, I'm committed to an economic rights framework, an inclusive economic rights framework, because again, it is the right thing to do. And I really believe it appeals to what is best in all people, Black, white, Asian, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Darrick, I can't think of a better note to leave this conversation on. Thank you for closing it out so beautifully. Thank you so much for being here and having this important conversation with us during Capital B Fest. And thank you to our audience for watching.
I genuinely get goosebumps talking to you, so thank you.
Thank you, Darrick.
Thank you so much to all of our guests for participating in these discussions. Tomorrow, we'll be back at 1 p.m. Eastern for more conversation from some of our smartest innovators. If you'd enjoyed the programming today, sign up for our newsletters, and don't forget, the best way to support Capital B is by becoming a member. See you tomorrow for day 2.